Hey guys, how you doing? In this session we are going to look at biomass and bioaccumulation, and this is the last um, session that we're going to do on chapter 8. Now, before I start, I'm going to apologize. I'm a little bit sick. Don't really know how it happened, and I also happen to be at my friend's house, and it is ridiculously cold, so I'm wrapped in a blanket, and I feel like I'm going to get a cold very soon. So my voice might sound a little bit croaky and a little bit funny. Okay, but hopefully you'll be able to hear me, and I'll try my best to speak as clearly as I can. Okay, let's take a look at biomass and bioaccumulation. Now the two terms are very closely related, but they are slightly different, and I'm going to try my best to explain this term as well as I can. Um, I mentioned a few times in the previous video about this idea that as you go further up the food chain, you lose a bit of energy, and I'll explain that a little bit more detail in a second. Okay. All right, definition or understanding what biomass actually is. So one of the key things to note is that when an organism consumes another organism, not all of that energy that the predator gets gets incorporated into its body. So not all of it goes to growth, and some of it is actually lost. In fact, a lot of it is actually lost to other important processes such as digestion, heat, and just normal activity. Yeah? And so the energy that is remaining in the organism after all of those things gets incorporated into its biomass. So the biomass is really the mass that the organism has in terms of its growth. Yeah. So it is basically animal and plant material. So a good example is, if you eat a banana, for example, not all of that energy that you get from the banana will actually, become incorporated as part of your muscles and your cells. Some of that energy is lost as heat, and then some of the energy is lost just to digest the banana, and others in terms of activity and so forth. Yeah. So we use biomass as a really good way to represent how energy moves through an ecosystem, but it's important to understand that as you go up the food chain, there is less biomass that is transferred to the next level. Now, on average, consumers only get 10% of the converted energy from their food into biomass. And that 10% is actually called the ecological efficiency. So when you think of ecological efficiency, you should be thinking of only 10% moving up the food chain, okay? Now, let's go with an example. So in this example here, suppose we have plant material that's being eaten by a caterpillar. If we say that there is 200 joules of energy in that plant, that one leaf that the caterpillar has eaten, of the 200 joules, we can assume that, let's say, about 100 joules of it, half of it is actually indigestible. Yeah, it's parts of the plant that the caterpillar can't actually digest, and so it actually gets passed out as waste in feces, right? We could say that to digest the leaf in the first place, the caterpillar needs to invest 67 joules of energy, and just to move around and have cellular respiration, it requires part of that 67 joules as well. So what that means is, of the 200 joules, 167 joules has already been used up, and the only amount available is the 33 joules, which then goes into the growth of the caterpillar, new cells, muscles, tissue, and so forth, that is actually available for bigger predators to actually take and consume. Okay, so you started off with 200, and in the end, what's available for the next level in our food chain is 33. Yeah. Now, it's worth mentioning that that's not to say that bigger organisms have less energy in them. Yeah, so um, you know I wouldn't say that the snake has 10 joules and then the bilby has 100 joules. What we're saying is, of the energy from the bottom, you get less and less as you move up throughout the population. Okay, so you might start off with 1 million joules of sunlight, but most of that gets wasted, and only 10,000 joules gets captured by the plants, and then of the 10,000, only 1,000 joules gets captured by the caterpillar, and then only 100 joules gets captured by the bilby and 10 joules by the snake. Yeah, which is why for an ecosystem to be healthy, there actually always needs to be more organisms down the bottom. There always needs to be more plants than there are herbivores, and there always needs to be more herbivores than there are carnivores, and more carnivores than there are apex predators. And so as you go up, you um, you lose about 90% of it, and only 10% goes onwards. Which is why the number of predators never really exceed 10% of their prey, because they actually need all of that prey in order to get to sustain that population of predators. Yeah, so that's biomass, and that's how we understand energy flow throughout ecosystems. Okay. It's also why typically there's only 4 to 5 trophic levels, because it becomes really hard to sustain a large population of apex predators and tertiary and quaternary consumers in the process. Which is why you also notice that your apex predators tend to have really large habitat ranges, because something like a lion needs to have kilometers and kilometers worth of or square kilometers worth of area just to have enough food source, because it needs a lot of variation. It needs a lot of prey to target on in order to capture as much energy as it possibly can. Okay. Now let's look at bioaccumulation and biomagnification. The two words are actually closely related, but they are different. Okay. Energy usually gets lost as you move up the system. However, some other things won't get lost. Some organic foods contain chemicals, and those chemicals are not broken down by the body, and so they accumulate in the body and therefore gets transferred up the system as you move further up the system. And so we have two different terms, and they mean slightly different things. Yeah, bioaccumulation occurs when a species or an individual actually accumulates a contaminant over time from its food source. So the contaminants, it could be any sort of chemical that is in the water column or in its food source. As the animal keeps eating the same food source, it will build up in its body. Now, biomagnification is when the contaminant not only builds up in the animal's body from accumulating, it then moves up the food chain when the animal gets eaten by other animals, and once again the contaminant doesn't leave the body. And so predators, large predators, your apex predators, continue to build up and magnify those contaminant levels. Yeah. Here's a diagram to sort of show what it looks like. In bioaccumulation, we're talking about one individual and eating the same food source. So, when it's a juvenile, it might have just a little bit of that contaminant, and then as it grows older, it continues to accumulate the contaminants in its flesh, and then by the time it gets to an adult, it might have really high levels. Yeah. In biomagnification, we have the same similar concept, except it moves up the food chain. So here, the contaminant might be in very, very small portions in krill. However, as the fish eat the krill, it accumulates in their flesh throughout the fish's lifetime. But as seals eat more fish, it magnifies the contaminant levels, and then the polar bear will have ridiculously high levels of contaminants. Now, these two concepts are very closely related. Bioaccumulation occurs in the individual, and then it results in more biomagnification. And so it's a kind of a double up effect. Okay. Mercury is a really good example of this. People often advise eating large amounts of tuna because of the mercury buildup in the tuna, and biomagnification is the reason for that. Okay. Mercury happens naturally in the environment, but it usually occurs at very low levels. However, volcanic activity, coal plants, human interferences, and mining often releases large amounts of mercury into the water. It occurs as runoff down your rivers, and then goes into the ocean, and then it accumulates in the krill. Now, as it accumulates, it also magnifies, because organisms that eat the krill will build up mercury in their flesh, and it never gets removed. And so by the time you get to things like tuna, which is what we have canned tuna, we put into our canned tuna, or shark or pike or any other sort of apex predator, the mercury levels accumulates not only throughout the lifetime, but it magnifies as you go up the food chain, and so it becomes ridiculously and dangerously high in your apex predator. And so you might start off with 23.2 micrograms of mercury in the Alaskan halibut, but then you might, by the time it gets to the tuna, because the tuna has eaten so much of the Alaskan halibut, it might go up to 55.8 for each tuna, and then 68.1, and then by the time you get to the swordfish, which is the top predator in that system, or the shark, you're looking at 222.3 micrograms. So you can see there, that's a factor of almost 10 times the level of mercury. And so, if you and I eat that swordfish, or the shark, or the tuna, it accumulates in our body, and we can get mercury poisoning, which is why they have regular consumption recommendations. And so they say, you shouldn't eat canned tuna for more than a couple of times a week or something like that. Otherwise, it becomes toxic to the body. Okay. Another example is bioaccumulation of DDT. So DDT is a particular chemical. The name there, if you want to try and pronounce it, is ridiculously hard to pronounce, but it's a chemical substance that we use in pesticides and insecticides. It takes 30 years to break down by the body, which means it accumulates faster than the rate at which it breaks down, and so it is really harmful in high concentrations. But we use it in farms and things like that to keep insect levels at bay. However, when it rains, it runs off into the environment, goes into the water, and once again, you have the same thing happening. Yeah. It might be in very, very small levels in the water, but the zooplankton will accumulate that in its flesh. It gets eaten by small fish, it gets eaten by larger fish, it gets eaten by sea birds, and what happens is, as it becomes extremely harmful at high levels, then what you get is that the species or the individuals within that species will die because of these toxic levels of DDT. Now, when that happens, particularly if it's a keystone species, it creates a top-down effect in your ecosystem, and you get trophic cascade. Yeah? And so there you have multiple concepts in ecosystems affecting one another, which is why you can sort of see, not only is things like insecticides and stuff bad for the environment, it has secondary effects like accumulating and magnifying in ecosystems. Okay. There you go. So that is all of Chapter 8. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and hopefully we'll be able to go through some more case studies as we get into class. All right, see you guys.